Welcome to today's deep dive. I am so glad you are joining us today because we have a truly fascinating literary mystery to unravel.
We really do. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So, picture one of the most famous stories of court intrigue, hidden identities, and ultimate survival, a story you probably think you know inside and out.
Right.
But what if I told you that this classic narrative wasn't entirely original? Like, what if it was actually a deliberate, highly sophisticated, and totally hidden parody of an even older foundational text?
It's a remarkable concept to consider. We're essentially looking at how an ancient author takes a really well-known, incredibly serious political history and just fundamentally rewrites it. They
Right.
strip it right down to its studs and rebuild it to serve completely new, subversive purpose.
Okay, let's unpack this. Our mission for this deep dive, based on a whole stack of sources, including academic essays and the comparative work of scholars like Amos Frisch and John Scrinnock, is to explore the hidden architecture of the Book of Esther. We are going to look at how this story is actually a self-conscious, intertextual rewriting of the first two chapters of First Kings. We're going to map out the parallels, the brilliant twists, and really the secret jokes hidden right there in the text.
And if you are listening to this right now and wondering, why ancient literary structure matters to your life today, I mean, this is essentially a masterclass in strategy.
Oh, absolutely.
If you want to understand how brilliant writers use the literary device of inversion to give a villain his absolute comeuppance, this is the blueprint. But on a much more practical level, it's a survival guide.
A survival guide for navigating power, right?
Exactly. It shows you exactly how to deal with an ineffectual leader and how to navigate complex systems of power when you are starting from a position of profound vulnerability.
So we have to start where both of these stories start, which is the setup. Specifically, the guy sitting on the throne. Right, the kings. In both 1 Kings 1 and the Book of Esther, we're introduced to a king who is fundamentally diminished. He's passive.
Yeah.
In 1 Kings 1, we meet King David, but it's not the giant-slaying warrior we're used to.
No, not at all.
He is at the very end of his life, and he's failing.
Yeah, the Hebrew text describes David here as Zaken. He is old, and crucially, he is cold. He literally cannot keep warm, no matter how many covers they put on him.
Right, they just keep piling them on.
And he's lost his vitality, which, you have to remember, in the ancient world, meant the kingdom itself was losing its vitality.
Wow, yeah.
Then you flip over to the Book of Esther, and we meet King Ahasuerus. Now, Ahasuerus isn't necessarily old or freezing to death, but he is politically and domestically humiliated right out of the gate.
By his own wife.
Exactly. He throws this massive opulent banquet to show off his absolute power, and Queen Vashti outright refuses to attend.
So in both cases, you have a ruler who should be at the absolute apex of power, but is entirely compromised.
The essential pattern here is passivity. Both of these kings are completely reactive. The scholar Michael Fox actually points out a crucial pattern in his comparative research. He says that Ahasuerus is essentially a comic amplification of King David.
A comic amplification, I love that.
Right, because where David's passivity is a natural, albeit tragic, consequence of physical decline, Ahasuerus' passivity is just his constitutional personality. He never initiates an action.
He just waits for someone to tell him what to do.
He only responds, usually impulsively and emotionally, to whatever stimulus is placed directly in front of him. They are instruments. They hold the absolute power of life and death, but they exercise that power entirely based on the machinations of their advisors.
Which means the king has a problem, but he doesn't actually solve it himself. He just sits there while the court scrambles. And in both stories, the advisors come up with the exact same structural solution, don't they?
They do. They need to scour the entire nation for a beautiful young woman.
Right. In 1 Kings, they're looking for someone to lie in David's bosom to keep him warm, which leads them to a young woman named Abishag. In Esther, they're looking for a new queen to replace Vashti, which leads them to Esther.
And it is not just a passing similarity in the plot. The comparative scholarship highlights the exact Hebrew parallels used in both narratives.
The actual words they use?
Yes. The texts use the exact same phrase, tavus mare, meaning good of appearance, to describe the candidates being rounded up. Abishag is called Yafa ad Miad, exceedingly beautiful, and Esther's beauty is emphasized using parallel vocabulary.
So it's very deliberate.
It is. It's a mechanical literary device to introduce the female protagonist who will actually drive the plot forward while the king remains passive.
I want to pause on that passivity for a second because I think a lot of people listening can probably relate to this dynamic. Think about any time you've had to navigate a workplace with a completely passive reactive boss.
Yeah.
The kind of leader who never sets a clear direction, who avoids conflict and just signs off on the idea of whoever happened to speak to them last.
If we connect this to the bigger picture for you, the listener, that is exactly the dynamic these texts are exploring. The story is showing you that in such environments, the real power doesn't actually sit on the throne or in the corner office.
Where does it sit?
The real power lies with the savvy intermediaries. It belongs to the people who know how to manage the boss, who know how to frame their own personal agendas as if they were the king's idea all along.
But wait, if I'm looking at this critically, right, I might say, come on, a passive king, a nationwide search for a beautiful girl. Aren't those just standard run-of-the-mill court intrigue tropes? How do we know the author of Esther didn't just stumble into the same cliches?
It is a completely fair question, and it is where the comparative textual analysis really shines. Research by scholars like John Scrinnock demonstrates that this is not a coincidence. It is a deliberate allusion through striking verbal echoes.
So they're leaving clues.
The author of Esther is leaving intentional breadcrumbs for the reader. It is the specific repetition of shared verbal formulas, placed in the exact same context, that proves this is a deliberate literary puzzle.
Okay, let's look at 3 of the most glaring linguistic neon signs that prove these stories were talking to each other. First, the language of the approach. When a character has to take a massive risk and walk into the throne room, both texts use the exact same phrase.
The Hebrew phrase is bo-el, meaning to come to the king. In 1 Kings, the prophet Nathan instructs Bathsheba to come to David to warn him about a coup.
And then in Esther.
In Esther, Mordecai instructs Esther to come to Ahasuerus to beg for her people's lives. It denotes a very specific, highly charged crossing of a physical and political boundary.
And then there's the moment they actually cross that boundary, the royal inquiry. When these women finally make that terrifying approach, both kings respond using the identical formula.
Yes, both David and Ahasuerus say malach, which translates to, "What is the matter with you?" or "What is your request?" What's fascinating here is how this specific phrase functions in the ancient court.
It sounds polite, but it's not really, is it?
It is a subtle assertion of royal power disguised as an invitation. The king is condescending to inquire, he is holding all the cards, and the supplicant has to seize that opening perfectly. They have to state their case without appearing to be too demanding or presumptuous.
Which leads us to the third phrase, and honestly, this one is the drumbeat of both stories. It's the relentless repetition of asking.
The root word is shel, meaning to ask, and the noun is she'elah, meaning request. The textual analysis notes that this word is used 7 times in rapid succession in 1 Kings 2 and 5 times in the corresponding climax of Esther. Ask, request, ask, request.
It builds this crazy rhythmic tension in the narrative.
It really does. Because in both narratives, a woman in a deeply dependent position has to make a request of a king whose reaction she cannot entirely predict. Both kings offer essentially a blank check.
Right, Solomon does it implicitly, and Ahasuerus does it explicitly.
Exactly, offering up to half the kingdom. But what's fascinating here is how these escalating requests start small but quickly reveal massive life or death consequences. Both kings offer whatever you ask, only for the ensuing request to completely destabilize the court.
And that destabilization brings us right to the core of the drama. Let's visualize this approach because the structural parallels and the inversions here are just incredible. Imagine the scene. A queen must enter the royal chamber unannounced to plead for her life.
High stakes.
Very high stakes. In 1 Kings, Bathsheba enters David's chamber to plead for the life of her son Solomon because his older brother Adonijah is staging a coup to steal the throne. In Esther, Queen Esther enters the inner court to plead for the life of the entire Jewish people against Haman's genocide.
Both women have to walk in and remind a forgetful, passive king of a past action that he hasn't fully reckoned with.
Right. Bathsheba has to remind David of an unfulfilled oath he made to her years ago about Solomon being his successor. And Esther has to remind Ahasuerus of a deadly, unreckoned decree that he carelessly signed just a few days prior.
Structurally, the scenes are identical. The mechanics of the plot are the same. But here is the masterful inversion. The author of Esther takes that structure and changes the context completely. Think about Bathsheba's position.
She has a lot of power.
She's a queen mother. She has high standing. She is walking into a familiar court, approaching a man she has known intimately for decades, where she holds significant privilege and leverage.
She belongs there.
Exactly. Esther, on the other hand, is a hidden minority. She is completely unsummoned. She hasn't been called to the king in 30 days. She is stepping into the inner court, risking immediate execution under an absolute Persian law.
Unless he extends the scepter.
Right, she is profoundly vulnerable.
So what does this all mean? If you're the ancient author of Esther and you want to write a brilliant survival guide for your people, why model your hero after Bathsheba? Bathsheba had all the institutional power to pull off her political maneuver. Esther has none of it.
It seems like a strange choice at first.
Yeah, isn't that a terrible strategic template to use?
It would be if it were a direct copy, but that is exactly why the inversion matters. The author of Esther is intentionally raising the stakes and shifting the entire genre. First Kings is a story about political succession, who gets to wear the crown.
Right.
Esther is a story about communal survival, who gets to live and who dies. Because Esther lacks Bathsheba's privilege and formal authority, her survival requires absolute tactical genius. She has no safety net to fall back on.
And speaking of safety nets, that brings us to the advisors. Because no one survives a royal court without an advisor, let's look at the advisor axis in these texts, which is completely flipped on its head.
The contrast here is brilliant.
In 1 Kings, you have Nathan the prophet and Bathsheba the queen. They are a team. They are in explicit collusion to save the day. Nathan even scripts her speech for her. He tells her exactly what to say to David, and then he brilliantly stages his own entrance to back her up.
The advisor and the protagonist are completely aligned. But in Esther, we see a brilliant structural inversion. The author takes that crucial advisor figure, the person who has the king's ear, and flips his alignment entirely. The primary advisor in Esther is Haman.
And Haman is definitely not colluding with the queen.
No, he is colluding with the king against the protagonist. The royal counselor, the guy who is supposed to be the Nathan figure guiding the kingdom toward justice, has become the villain.
Which leaves Esther completely isolated inside the palace walls. She's flying blind. But wait, she does have an advisor, just not an official one.
Mordecai.
Yes, the true Nathan.
If you map the roles, Mordecai is the functional equivalent of Nathan in the Esther story. But instead of being an institutional insider with a permanent pass to the throne room, he's a prophetic outsider. He sits at the king's gate. He is the one coaching the woman who has the king's ear.
Which is such a powerful message for the listener.
It really is. The diaspora message here is that in the real world, you don't always have official institutional support. You don't have a Nathan on the royal payroll looking out for your best interests. Sometimes survival requires operating totally outside the establishment.
Relying on your own wits. But the author doesn't just leave us wallowing in that tension. They use this intertextual framework to deliver some of the most satisfying comeuppances in all of literature.
Yep.
Summit reversal.
Ah, yes, the summit reversal.
It is that exact split-second moment when the villain, who is at the absolute peak of his power, is suddenly destroyed by a single, completely misinterpreted command from the king.
Let's start with the older text, 1 Kings 2. Adonijah, the older brother who tried to usurp the throne, goes to Bathsheba to ask King Solomon if he can marry Abishag. He frames it as a modest request.
Thinking it's no big deal, but taking the former king's concubine is a direct claim to the throne.
Exactly. Solomon reads it as a coup and sentences him to death instantly. A catastrophic miscalculation born of arrogance.
Then you look at how Esther plays with that exact same dynamic in chapter 7. Haman is at Esther's private banquet. He thinks he's the king's absolute favorite. He's at the summit. Suddenly, Esther revealed his plot to murder her and her people.
And Haman panics.
He absolutely panics. He realizes he is doomed, and he falls onto the couch where Esther is reclining, begging for his life.
And right at that exact moment, King Ahasuerus walks back into the room. He sees this chaotic scene. And because he's the reactive, foolish king we established earlier, he comically misreads the entire situation. He thinks Haman is trying to assault the queen. That single misinterpretation seals Haman's fate. He is sentenced to death.
Just incredible. Both villains destroyed in an instant. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. Before the villains actually meet their end, we get the procession of the chosen.
The parade.
The ultimate comeuppance. In 1 Kings, Solomon rides David's royal mule. The Hebrew text uses the word prida. He is paraded to massive public acclaim, proving his legitimacy. It's very serious political theater.
And this is where the author of Esther takes that serious historical record and turns it into pure comic distortion. Ahasuerus asks Haman how to honor someone, and Haman, in his overwhelming arrogance, assumes the king is talking about him.
So he scripts his own parade.
He suggests the man should ride the king's own horse, this as led by a noble official. But the irony is delicious. Haman is forced to lead his mortal enemy Mordecai on the king's horse through the streets. The wrong man rides, the wrong man leads, and the villain has to shout his enemies' praises.
And the psychological destruction doesn't end there. Both villains return home hoping for good news from their allies, the bad news messengers.
Right. Jonathan tells Adonijah his bid has collapsed, and Zeresh tells Haman his downfall is absolute.
Which brings us to the resolution, cleaning house. Both narratives finish with the chosen one elevated and the opposing party systematically wiped out. Solomon executes his rivals, and in Esther, Haman is executed and the Jewish people are saved.
But the tonal shift is what's crucial here. 1 Kings 2 is ruthless political realism. Solomon executes Joab at the altar. It's morally ambiguous, bloody consolidation. It's high political tragedy.
But Esther isn't a tragedy.
No. Esther domesticates this political violence into a festive, carnivalesque comedy of survival. The villain hangs on his own absurdly tall gallows.
A total dark comedy.
The author of Esther took the high political tragedy of the Deuteronomistic history and transformed it into a dark comedy suited for a vulnerable diaspora community.
So, just to recap the journey for you today, we've seen how Esther isn't just a simple fairy tale, but a highly erudite, technically precise literary puzzle. By mapping the ineffectual king, the verbal clues, and the brilliant inversions of Bathsheba to Esther and Nathan to Haman, the author created an absolute masterpiece of survival literature.
It really leaves you with a lingering question, though. If the ancient author of Esther could take a sacred foundational history of a legendary king and completely flip its script to create a witty, subversive survival guide for their own vulnerable era, what untouchable foundational stories in our own modern culture are just waiting to be inverted, parodied, and rewritten to help us survive today?
What a fantastic question to leave off on. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into the hidden architecture of these ancient texts. We love unpacking these with you, and we will see you next time.